Before we get this video started, basic knowledge of SUPERHOT's gameplay mechanics is required to understand what I'm talking about here. I highly recommend you watch my review of the original game before watching this MTO. In addition, please be advised that SUPERHOT Mind Control Delete has frequent bright flashes of light, although it is not anywhere near as severe as the original game. So if you're photosensitive, you may not want to watch this. And with that, on to the video. Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on SUPERHOT Mind Control Delete. This is a first-person shooter by the SUPERHOT team that was released in July of this year, and it is the follow-up to SUPERHOT and SUPERHOT VR. The only one of those that I've actually taken a look at is the original SUPERHOT, because I do not have a VR setup at this time. And in the interest of full disclosure, I did receive a copy of this for free, but not directly. It was kind of a weird indirect thing, because I received a review copy of the original SUPERHOT, and because I had that in my Steam library when they put out Mind Control Delete, they had a policy of anybody who had SUPERHOT up to a certain point would just automatically get Mind Control Delete for free. So in a weird roundabout way, the review copy that I was provided of the original SUPERHOT led to me sort of getting a review copy of SUPERHOT Mind Control Delete. So do with that information what you wish, but let's go ahead and actually start talking about Mind Control Delete here. What exactly are we dealing with, and why is this an MTO rather than a full review? Well, obviously the reason it's an MTO is because I could not finish it. And those of you who follow me on Twitter may have noticed the post I made about this particular game where I said that the game I was working on this week was so boring that I ended up installing another game, playing through that game in its entirety, and getting an entire video done on that after only being able to manage 30 minutes or so of gameplay of this before I just got bored and needed to take a break. Now, I actually have plans for that other video, so you're not going to be seeing that anytime soon, and I'm not going to reveal what it was. But suffice to say, that's probably pretty damning condemnation of SUPERHOT Mind Control Delete, in the sense that if that game is so boring that I would rather go through the entire process of installing, playing through, recording a review, editing that review, and compiling that review, especially considering that that particular review required me to record things in such a way that I actually had to recompile the video footage before it actually worked properly in my editing software. You know there's something horribly wrong here. So what is it about SUPERHOT Mind Control Delete that ultimately drove me up the wall? Well, we're going to go ahead and put that aside for just a moment and talk about the good things first. It has great aesthetics, much like the original game. In fact, it looks almost identical to the original game, which came out 4 years ago. Now don't get me wrong, I have no problems with the aesthetic being the same as the original SUPERHOT, because it's a very striking aesthetic that looks great. The problem is that when you compare the visuals in this to the visuals of the original SUPERHOT, it's almost like they just copy-pasted everything. And I mean that from the level geometry, to the various items you can pick up and throw, to the weapons, to the character models, and the way they break apart, and all of the animations and such. If you've played the original SUPERHOT and you go into this one, you're gonna notice almost immediately that everything looks almost exactly the same, if not exactly the same. Now don't get me wrong, that's not necessarily a problem if they took that stuff, used it as a base, and made something new and interesting with it. But unfortunately, they didn't do that. Instead, they just took the stuff from the original SUPERHOT, maybe did very minimal tweaks to it, and just plopped it right into Mind Control Delete, added a new gun and a few new throwables, and basically called it a day. So right from the get-go, if you've played the original SUPERHOT, this is going to be very familiar to you, and not necessarily in a good way. Now this is where I need to bring up my original SUPERHOT review, because I mentioned a few things that were particularly important in that. The original SUPERHOT was actually a Game Jam title before it became a full standalone thing that they decided to charge money for. And it's easy to see where as a Game Jam title, where they're just experimenting with mechanics and aesthetics and trying to make something cool and interesting, it would work really well. But the problem was when it came time to turn that into a full retail product, they didn't really deliver, and it ended up becoming very repetitive very quickly and basically wearing out its welcome. So in the 4 years since the release of the original SUPERHOT, we also had SUPERHOT VR, but then this came out, and you may ask yourself, what did the developers learn from their mistakes with the original SUPERHOT? Well, they ended up putting some variety into the game in the form of the so-called hacks and cores. Cores are special abilities that you can basically build your runs around, things like additional health pips, because you actually have health in this game now instead of just dying in one hit like you did in the original game. But they're not just passive abilities, there's also active abilities like the charge, which you'll be seeing me use in this video, which allows you to quickly jump over to an enemy and whack them upside the head. The way they've structured the game is to have a maze of nodes that you can go to, and whenever you go to a node, you select whatever core you have, as long as you have more than one core available to you anyway. And once you've made your selection, you are dropped into a series of levels where you have to fight your way through the groups of enemies until eventually you manage to get all the way through them, and you can move on to the next node. In between some of the levels, you'll have the opportunity to select between one of two different hacks available to you, which can be things like supercharging your throws so that things will actually go through enemies or will bounce off of them or things like that, or being able to get additional hearts, or being able to refill your hearts, or being able to move faster, or even some slightly zany things like whenever you're damaged, you'll send out a blast of shuriken in all different directions, or even until the end of whatever node you're on, you'll just continue to start the levels with a particular weapon, whether that be a random gun or a katana. Now, I think the idea behind these various hacks and the cores is to give the game a bit more strategy and to spice things up a bit. And it certainly does that for the first few nodes that you play through, but then you continue playing through them and you start to notice the repetition. I mean, sure, as you continue to get further into the game, you're going to gain access to additional cores and additional hack types that will allow you to spice up the gameplay just a bit, but you'll quickly realize that it only spices the gameplay up for just a brief moment, and when you continue to observe things as you're playing through, you will notice that you are playing on the same maybe 5 to 8 maps the entire game, with enemies that just spawn in from the doorways in the map and run up to you and start attacking you, and the only real variety that you're going to be noticing is, of course, what weapons they're carrying, and you're also going to notice that certain enemies have certain areas of their bodies blocked off, so you can only damage them if you hit the parts of their bodies that are red. Meanwhile, when you get the story progression in the game, it just keeps telling you that what you're doing is pointless and you're just stuck in an endless cycle, and why are you even bothering with this crap? And I thought to myself, you know what, that's a good question. Why was I bothering with SUPERHOT Mind Control Delete? Because it's effectively the same exact game I played before, except not done as well because it wasn't anywhere near as well structured. They've replaced the designed encounters of the original SUPERHOT with randomized crap in this one that just ends up being a matter of constantly spinning around because the enemies will constantly spawn behind you, or spawn to your left, or spawn to your right, because you have no real way of knowing which door they're going to jump out of, because you're just playing through the same maps over and over and over again, fighting the same enemies over and over and over again. And to make matters worse, if you fail and your health bottoms out during a run, then you start that entire node over again from the very beginning. And whenever that happens, it will not only make you lose any hacks that you've earned on that particular run, but it will randomize which hacks are available to you again, and it will randomize which levels are displayed again, as if you're going to a brand new node entirely. So it's not even like the original SUPERHOT in the sense that basically every single combat encounter in that game was a puzzle you had to figure out, and there were different ways of solving it more optimally than others. But that's not how Mind Control Delete works. Because everything is randomized, there isn't really a puzzle for you to solve as much as there's just a combat encounter for you to complete that has the same solution pretty much every single time. This is a great example of a game where the gameplay mechanics are really not conducive to randomization. I mean, sure, the mechanics will still function, and they certainly do in this. It is a playable game after all. But whereas the original SUPERHOT continued to build upon itself and have clear, careful designs put in to maximize certain mechanics at certain points, but Mind Control Delete is not carefully designed. It's not something that builds upon itself as much as it just throws a bunch of random crap at you and says, think fast. And that would be fine if they did it for only a couple of levels here and there, but the entire game is like this, and the problem with that is that the things it's throwing at you are from a very limited pool of items, so you'll ultimately be encountering the same things constantly, and it just gets even more repetitive even more quickly than the original SUPERHOT. And between that and the story, which pretty much constantly asks you why you're even bothering with the game because it's just going to be the same thing over and over and over again, only to culminate in an ending which forces you to wait 2.5 hours while it recovers files just so you can replay content that you've already beaten. And what makes that so much worse is just how pretentious the developers are in that regard. They seem to think that making you wait 2.5 hours in real time with the game running, because it will not actually count down the timer unless you have the game open and running the entire time, is some sort of avant-garde artistic decision to where you're supposed to reflect on what you have achieved throughout the entire game and what it was trying to tell you. And keep in mind, the 2.5 hours is a compromise on their part. Originally, it was 8 hours, where they specifically said that that was the perfect time to sleep on it. Right, because what I'm totally going to do is leave a video game running for 8 hours as I take a nap. I mean, if the developers weren't so full of themselves in this regard and weren't so convinced that they're being way more clever than they actually are being, then you'd think it was some sort of joke. But no, this is actually how the game is. I mean, if the timer only had to go for, say, 10 to 20 minutes, or if it were allowed to run while the game itself is not running, then that would be one thing. But because you have to have the game running the entire time, it crosses well beyond the border of being obnoxious and plants its flag firmly in that territory. And between the randomized encounters on the same handful of maps over and over again getting incredibly repetitive incredibly quickly, the difficulty not really making that much of a difference, and the hacks and cores not doing enough to keep the gameplay variety fresh and interesting throughout, just makes this not worth bothering with. You could certainly make an argument for the original SUPERHOT because it was a bit more fresh and exciting when it came out, but Mind Control Delete is basically taking the same exact thing and doing it worse in almost every single way. It is very much an instance of style over substance, and the substance that is there is just not enough to carry the experience. Like I said, you can make an argument for the original SUPERHOT, but definitely not Mind Control Delete, especially considering that they want $25 for each of them, which is pretty ridiculous even for the original SUPERHOT, but with Mind Control Delete especially so. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review or additional equipment or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on later videos.